Good evening here in Switzerland. Good afternoon in Canada. I'm going to talk about this book with the man who wrote it, Westminster School, Reflections of a Boarder, Andrew Kavchak. And there he is with that book again. You can get this book on Amazon, and I believe it's well worth a read. And that's not just because I contributed to it. But Andrew, I'm going to put a few questions to you about it, because I suspect that I'm one of the people at the moment in the world who's read it more carefully than most of the world's population so far. Clearly, quite a lot of the book is unhappy, but there are some very happy bits as well, I'm delighted to say. So let's start with the positive bit, shall we? What's your happiest memory of Westminster School where you were a boarder?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Paul, for organizing this interview, but also for your enthusiastic willingness to contribute the afterword, and also for communicating with me while I was writing it and answering my questions and providing me with so much information that helped to spark some of my memories as well. Yeah, in terms of wonderful memories from Westminster, in fact, there are plenty. Probably the one that sticks out the most in my mind was the moment when I received news that I was accepted and that I was going to be a boarder in Busby's house. I tried the exam twice. The first time was shortly after I arrived in England, and I was totally unprepared. I mean, it was a 2.5-day long exam with not just written exams in every subject that was of interest in the school, but also interview, a panel interview. And well, I failed the first time, but then spent 6 months at a cramming school preparing for the second attempt. And that cramming school did a great job. I felt very confident the second time, and that successful attempt and the news from the school that I was admitted was a huge source of joy and pride. The other thing about the time that I spent at the Westminster that I always remember with great fun, the most exciting, I think, was every morning going through the medieval cloisters to pray in the abbey. One just felt that there was practically a millennium of people who had gone through these same steps before, and it was a remarkable opportunity and an honor and a privilege to be in those surroundings. Yeah, the other thing is just many of the students at the school were just, it was such a different environment than what I had been used to in Canada, that it was exciting. It was just
well, one little part of that being different, of course, is Latin, right? And you cleverly managed to avoid that in your entrance exam. But of course, when praying, you couldn't avoid it entirely. Latin prayers is a topic that comes up more than once in your book, and it's certainly one of my enduring memories. How much of the Lord's Prayer can you still say in Latin if you're put to the test?
I regret to say that in the past 45 years, I have not attempted at repeating the Lord's Prayer in Latin once, and regrettably, my memory of those words that we so eagerly, or at least I did, read off the page without really knowing what we were saying, or at least not me. I've forgotten, but I included in the book the full text of the Lord's Prayer in Latin, and when I read the opening line, it sparked some memory. Something came back.
Yeah, so this book offers an education in itself, not least because you include Latin in it. But joking apart, you left Westminster in 1977, and this book has just come out very recently. And I know you've been busy with an awful lot of other things in your life, including many other books, but why did this one take so long? Is what I've been wondering while reading it.
Well, a good question. You know, from the moment that I left Westminster and returned to Montreal, I had this feeling that what I had just experienced was so different and unique, at least for Canadians, a Canadian teen, that, you know, I was duty bound to at some point write about it. And so it was always on my list of things to do at appropriate time. So the first thing was, of course, finishing school, then getting a career going, and getting married, starting a family. And you know, I spent my career basically at a computer, and so the last thing I wanted to do when going home afterwards was spend more time at a computer reading.
Sure.
A couple of years ago, I took early retirement and discovered the joy of modern technology, particularly with the internet and print-on-demand technology that has made you know, self-publishing and making books available on a global scale instantly so easy. And so after writing a couple of other books that had been, you know, of great interest, you know, topics of history for me, I knew that the time had come for me to finally record my thoughts and reflections on my experience at Westminster. But I'm glad that I waited this time, because I did a lot of research while preparing the book and writing it. And in the process, not only picked up many of the books that had been written about Westminster in the 19th and early 20th century, but many of the books that had been published since I was at Westminster, most notably the books by the headmaster when we were there, Dr. John Ray. So many of, you know, his two books in particular about his time as headmaster were, you know, only published, well, one of them that posthumously in, I think, 2006. And so I'm glad that I waited to read those books, because I, in fact, quote many passages from those books and describe how, you know, my experience intermeshed, and how the writings of Dr. Ray helped to understand why things were the way they were. The other thing, by the way, is that also several other books had been published in the 90s and more recently in the 2010s in the field of, you know, the history of boarding schools and this culture in Britain, and the phenomena of so-called boarding school syndrome. And I'm also glad that I waited until I read those books, because they also feature prominently in several chapters.
Well, we'll come back on to that in a moment, but perhaps to put this in the context of your other books. History, as you've said, that's a recurring theme in your books, in most of them, and certainly in all your books that I'm aware of, a personal connection with the topic you're writing about. So certain similarities, but what were the particular challenges of writing this as opposed to any of your other books?
Well, you know, this book is, you know, an autobiographical account, but it's also a history text. I've read as many books as I could get my hands on about the history of Westminster School in order to better understand the context of where I was and what I was doing there. And that was a bit of a challenge. Many of the books are, of course, you know, out of print, but fortunately, again, with modern internet technology, it's possible to order used books from bookstores around the world. And so collecting those, going through them, and trying to summarize what I think are the most salient points, the important points in the history and the milestones of the schools over the past, you know, 900 years, basically, without being unnecessarily like repetitive of what's already been written. But I think I did so and focused on some periods and events and persons that should be of interest to young students and students at the school who are interested in the background, because there certainly is a lot of quirky history. Yeah, so I really wouldn't describe the thing as a challenge. It was just the process of recording from my diaries that I retrieved from the attic, which I hadn't visited and seen in years, and then going through the various drafts until I was satisfied that I had a decent manuscript, which I then shared with a number of people, including you, to get your feedback and comments.
Right. Well, I hope we provided some useful input. If you ask 10 old Westminsters, you probably get 12 opinions. So there we go. But like your other books, this one has certain major themes to it. And if you had to mention the top 3 fil rouge going through this book, the top 3 themes, what do you see as those?
Oh, well, thank you. That's very interesting, because I think in the 350 pages in the book, there's certainly a number of themes, or at least recurring episodes that are linked, and some may trigger greater interest in readers than others. But obviously, a main theme is, one experience of one Canadian who left Canada at 13 and became a boarder at an elite British boarding school in the heart of London, and just describing what the experience was like, and the feelings and the impact on my my own sort of psychology and mental health, how I was dealing with this, because my parents were in Canada throughout it, and so I very much felt alone. I think there's an issue of the old and the new, the environment and the tradition and the history of Westminster just oozed out of the walls. One just felt that you were stepping back in time, especially when walking over medieval cobblestones and through medieval archways, and having your meals in what was a 14th century abbot's dining hall, the refectory that's still in operation after all these centuries. I mean, it's such a wonderful contrast between the old and the new, because there were so many developments at the time. For example, I make reference, just like Dr. Ray did in his books, to the political challenges of the period, which included, of course, IRA terrorist bombings, for example, in downtown.
Yeah.
And well, besides that, one of the big themes that's one personal to me was the issue of my coming of age and my relationship with my parents. My parents separated and then divorced just before I went to England, and it had created a sort of a schism between us. And being sent away to a boarding school, while at first sounded like a wonderful opportunity and a unique privilege, eventually it came to be a burden, in the sense that there was a cost to it. And I don't mean financial cost, which of course there was, but that there was a lot of sacrifice involved. And I think for young teens to not see their parents for extended periods of time, I can say, based on my own experience, is a very painful painful thing. And so throughout the book, I think I try to describe how what seemed to me to be a deteriorating state of happiness or lack thereof as the time stretched on, you know, it's an important part of adolescent psychology.
As a reader, and obviously having some inside knowledge as well, one of the other recurring themes, perhaps slightly lower down the list, is girls. And you do spend quite a lot of time talking about the girls. And that's appropriate because for all Westminster's historical oozing, as you put it, it was also one of the first schools of its type to take what was regarded as a fairly progressive step or two forward, and those steps included admitting girls. So a lot of your year at Westminster was pretty miserable, but the girls seem to have been a reasonable antidote to that at times. How would you now, in retrospect, view their role in making your life happier or worse in that year? And without, you know, giving away too many secrets, but
okay, well, thank you. I think there's a wonderful move of Westminster to begin admitting girls at the school, which, if I read correctly, the first ones on an experimental basis began in 1969, but by the early 70s, it was clear that this was a trend that was going to last and that it was permanent. And I gather now at the school that it's pretty much completely co-ed and that there are, girls' boarding houses. So I think that's a wonderful development. Frankly, I think that the sending adolescents and kids to single-sex schools is a form of torture or cruelty. I very much regret that, you know, the girls that were at Westminster at the time that I was there and you were limited to strictly the sixth form, those, going to take their A levels. So there were none in our classes or any of our groups or extracurricular activities. However, there were girls that one would see in the hallways or in the Little Dean's Yard or in the in the dining hall at College Hall. But the thing is that, what I noticed is that the few of them were always surrounded by what appeared to be bodyguards who worked in shifts. And I remember on several occasions, wondering if there was ever going to be a time that I'd be able to have a chat with one or the other. And basically, I was only able to, I think, communicate with some of the sixth form girls who were day students at Busby's house. So those were wonderful. And one of them, by the way, was Penelope Way, one of the daughters of Dr. John Ray, who was the headmaster. And she obviously, spent more time with the older boys, but I think that, for adolescents, it's abnormal to not, be in the company of both sexes. And I feel sorry for all the boys who were at Westminster for all those centuries before 1969 and 1970. And I think the students who are at the school now are very, very fortunate.
Well, absolutely. But I think my sister, who was very glad she went to a single-sex girls' school for educational reasons, because the boys can be a real nuisance in our sort of age group at that stage, might take you to task for that. But anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole this evening. How has the school reacted so far? I mean, you dish out some praise, but also there's quite a lot of misery in this book. Any reactions from Little Dean's Yard or even Dean's Yard to this one, the main two school areas?
Well, you know, I published the book in late March. And while I was writing it, I contacted the school and indicated that I was writing this book and that I intended to make it available on Amazon. And I inquired as to whether or not the school would be interested in vetting, so-called vetting, you know, or reviewing a draft manuscript. And fortunately, there was interest, and I'm very glad to say that Elizabeth Wells, who is the school's archivist, reviewed a copy and gave me her comments. They weren't extensive, and there was nothing particularly groundbreaking. I was very happy to see that basically my historical account in what is the biggest chapter in the book about the history of the school and how over the centuries the political context and how it affected the school, that I got that right.
Pretty right. Okay, so she was happy. Well, that's good.
Well, after I published the book, I sent the school, the development office, a dozen copies, and I sent some emails to the library and to the headmaster, Dr. Savage. And I received some emails back saying, for example, the headmaster wrote back and said that he was going to read it and was going to provide me with his feedback. I haven't received anything yet, but I think it's worth noting that in the meantime, there was a coronation that took place. And so I think a number of people at the school may have had other pressing matters to attend to. Yes,
I suspect they've been busy shouting "Vivat" or whatever they've been doing recently. Now, in your honour, this evening I am sporting the old Westminster tie, but most of the world's population doesn't want to wear one of these. Why should anyone who hasn't been to Westminster or didn't go there want to read this book?
Yeah, well, okay, anybody who is interested in an unusual story may find it interesting. Right now, over the past number of years, and even in the most recent issue of The Economist, there's an article about the controversies relating to the different opinions about the role of public schools, or as they're known as independent schools, and the boarding schools in British political culture. And I think anybody who's interested in you know, for example, a case study of what may be considered, you know, boarding school syndrome, any, you know, people who are, for example, interested in that field, or any psychotherapists who are working with what are referred to as boarding school survivors in some quarters, may find the book of interest. I think Canadians who are interested in British history may find some of the chapters interesting, and people who are interested in how the schools like Westminster were managed, or, you know, there's so many quotes there, and one particular chapter about Dr. Ray, that anybody interested in Dr. Ray and his impact and legacy, you know, what he did for the school, I think would enjoy the book. And I think it's just a good story.
Well, so do I, but I'm of course slightly biased. So interesting. No, lots of good reasons, even if you've never even been near the school. In a sense, you and I are complete opposites. And another recurring theme that you haven't yet mentioned in this book are the likes of Frampton and the Rolling Stones and that lot, the music of the era. And I say we're opposites because you hated the boarding and loved London, and I loved the boarding and hated London. If things had worked out differently in your life, could you have imagined later living in London and sending a child to Westminster as a day pupil to get the best of both those worlds? Or is that something where you say, no, really, it's got to be the Canadian educational system?
You know, that option of being a day student at Westminster would have been my preferred option if I'd had that opportunity. The boarding was for me at first an interesting novelty because I had no experience with it, but it very quickly became a source of discomfort because I missed my home and I missed my parents. And I think if I was living in London, like so many day boys did, and I should mention also that besides your afterword in the book, there is a foreword from our classmate, Jonathan Carlson, who is a wonderful friend of mine that I met even before that very first attempt at writing the exam, entrance exam. And he was a day boy. And I very much, was envious at the end of every day when he was able to go home and be with his parents and his siblings. And, so I think that would have been the ideal situation. And I would certainly, if I lived in London and had a child, if we could get the child into Westminster School, I think it would be a wonderful opportunity, and I'd certainly support it.
Okay, and I'm sure that you would enjoy London life in other ways, as you did at school. You moved in very different musical circles to me. So another fun reason to read this book. I perhaps come to a last question. Inevitably, in a book about schools, teachers play a large role in both in folklore and in history and in reflections. And your book is, as it says on the front page, Reflections of a Boarder. Now, some of your particular teachers don't shine particularly well, particularly with hindsight. I think I was probably luckier by and large with the ones that I had, although we know quite a few in common. Another group of people at the school who get off surprisingly lightly, and you're unusually kind, I think, to them, are the scholars. And the Queen's Scholars, who formed the basis of the original school created by Elizabeth I. And we have to remember, it was a woman who set up a boys' school, Andrew. So any comments about single-sex education? And so, it was a woman to blame, all right? But anyway, she set it up, provided the scholarships, and they're now King's Scholars again. But when we were there, they were Queen's Scholars. They changed with the monarch, unlike at Eton, for example. Now, the scholars were known for being a pretty obnoxious, arrogant lot, because they'd passed a special exam and they thought they were terribly clever, the bee's knees, I think my mum would say. You're kind to them, but let's be candid now. What did you think of the scholars, frankly?
Well, I will be candid. My recollection is that I, in fact, had a tremendous amount of respect for them. They went through the challenge, which was a separate exam that was much more difficult than the regular entrance exam, which at that time was a unique one that Westminster held before adopting the common entrance one, which was the exam that most of the public schools had been following. And it was clear that academically, intellectually, school-wise, the scholars were an elite in a school of elites. And there was so much tradition and privilege attached to that. I mean, those who wore the green tie were the scholars. I remember going into the first week and the first day of school or second day into the tuck shop when we were to be fitted with our uniforms, and there were black ties and blue ties, and then there were some kids that wore green ties. And when I inquired, you know, and found out that those were the scholars, and you know, later discovering that the scholars had a number of historic sort of functions in the school and privileges, such as being able to you know, walk into the public gallery in the House of Commons and watch the political debates, which is apparently a tradition that's been around for decades or centuries. Yeah, I understood that many of the boys could come off as being full of themselves, but I understood it, and I respected them. I remember you and I had many conversations, particularly on the tube on the way to the water station when we did rowing, and you visited my house, and we played ping pong together, and pinball. The Busby's house in the playroom had a pinball
Indeed.
machine, which was fantastic because it was the first time in my life that I really got to play a lot of pinball. And then when I went to university at the University of Toronto during the opening week student festivities, I actually won a pinball competition. And yeah.
Well prepared by Westminster. Wonderful.
I have Westminster and Busby's playroom to thank for that. Yeah, so you know, it was obvious that, you know, there was a degree of, you know, among some of the students who were Queen Scholars of what could be described as snobbery, but it didn't particularly, you know, turn me off. I had a small group of friends, most notably, you know, Jonathan Carlson in our class and several other boys at Busby's house, and yeah, I have a lot of respect for the scholars.
And as you
by the way, and every time I speak with you, I am just reminded of just how educated scholars can be, and what a pleasure it is, because you have got, I think, one of the best vocabularies of anyone that I've come across in my life, and it's always a pleasure to exchange emails with you, because I frequently discover a new word.
Well, that's very, very kind of you. Some of them I just make up, but no, I think it was always also very good to be intellectually overshadowed by most of the girls, who were largely more able than we are. And this last coronation, by the way, was the first one in history in which female scholars, Westminster scholars in the narrow sense of the term, joined in those shouts of vivat for the new monarch. So there we go. The wheel has come a large circle since the late 1970s. Andrew, thank you very much for talking about this book, Reflections of a Border, and I think both those words are important, as is, of course, the word Westminster, because it was not only a school, but a very interesting geographical location. So thank you very much. As I say, I've read the book, and I can only urge others to do so, and Andrew's just explained why people who aren't old Westminsters should get in there as well.